Return to Tomorrow, The Time Bubble, Book 11, by Jason Ayres. Read by Samuel James. Chapter 1. Thomas. The memory of the day I discovered I was different from everybody else is indelibly etched on my mind. It was a sweltering June afternoon in the beautiful summer of 1976 when Terry French fell off the climbing frame in the playground at school. The ramshackle construction of rusting metal bars and rotting wooden planks would have been instantly condemned by modern health and safety standards, but things were laxer in those days. There was no soft landing for Terry on the spongy rubber material that constitutes the surface of modern play areas. He felt the full brunt of good old-fashioned tarmac that had seen better days. The faded, painted lines applied years ago were barely visible through the crumbling surface. Dandelions and other weeds were establishing themselves in the cracks. It was only thanks to sheer good fortune that no one had injured themselves on it before. Moments before Terry fell, I had been badgering the sole playground supervisor on duty. Miss Morris was a young trainee teacher who had drawn the short straw of keeping an eye on the kids while her colleagues were busy smoking in the staff room. "Miss, Terry's going to fall off and hurt himself. You've got to do something." I watched as my classmate climbed onto the top bar of the frame. He stood up straight and balanced precariously on the narrow strip of metal. "Look at me!" exclaimed Terry. "I'm Evel Knievel!" He had persuaded 3 other boys to lie flat across the flimsy planks that formed the top of the frame. Anyone who had been impressed by the stunts of Evel Knievel on television would have guessed what he was planning to do. However, the teacher seemed uninterested. Why did I know what was going to happen, but she didn't? "He's fine, Thomas. Now stop pestering and go and play," she replied. I knew that he wasn't going to be fine because I had seen it all before. He was going to leap over the boys, pretending they were double-decker buses, and injure himself in the process. Sure enough, a few seconds later it happened exactly to script. Although he had managed to clear the other kids successfully, he lost his footing on the landing side. He let out a piercing cry as he plummeted off the far side of the rickety death trap onto the unforgiving ground several feet below. "Oh my God!" exclaimed Miss Morris, finally waking up to the situation. Her language would have incurred the disapproval of the headmaster if he had been within earshot. Old Mr. Millington was forever banging on about not taking the Lord's name in vain during morning assembly. She ran over to where Terry had fallen. He was screaming in pain, and it was easy to see why. His leg was twisted at a horrible angle. A gaggle of fascinated kids began to gather around, eager to gawp at their fallen comrade. "Miss, what happened?" asked a tall, freckled girl from one of the older classes. "Is he going to die?" "No, he isn't, Angie. Now, run to the office and tell them to call an ambulance. And get Miss Lang while you're about it. She's trained in first aid." I moved closer to take another look. I was as curious as the other kids, but not about Terry's fate. I couldn't understand why it seemed like a shocking surprise to them. Hadn't they seen this coming, just as I had? Apparently, they hadn't. This was the first time it crossed my mind that perhaps others didn't see the world the way I did. "Don't worry, miss," I said confidently. "The ambulance will be here in a few minutes and he will be fine. He comes back to school with crutches in a few weeks." When she turned and looked at me, I had a distinct feeling that I had said the wrong thing. "How did you know this would happen?" she demanded, with a questioning, almost accusatory look in her eyes. It made me feel uncomfortable. I was only 5 years old, but even at that tender age, I could sense what she was thinking. There's something not right about this boy. From that day onwards, I knew that my ability to see the future was no common human trait. Miss Morris certainly didn't seem to possess it, nor did any of the other kids. Was it only me? If that was the case, then why? What made me so special? It would be some years before I figured it all out. In the meantime, I had no idea where my premonitions were coming from or when they would pop into my head. I couldn't see everything, just random snippets here and there. If you had asked me to stand at the side of the street and tell you the colour of the next car to come along, I would have been no more successful at guessing than the next person. My flashes of insight were unpredictable and usually focused on significant events, those that you would remember for years afterwards. I had recalled nothing about Terry and his accident until the day I saw him on the climbing frame. That was the moment that had triggered the memory. Nothing much of note happened in school on a day-to-day basis, but his accident was a big deal. Years later, people would still say, "Do you remember that time Terry fell off the climbing frame?" Sometimes I could foresee events that lay years or even decades in the future. A few weeks after the Terry incident, we had our regular Friday afternoon circle time in the classroom. During these sessions, we all sat cross-legged on the floor and our teacher would initiate a discussion topic. This week, Miss Lang asked what we wanted to be when we grew up. Lots of kids eagerly stuck up their hands and proclaimed confidently that they were going to be a nurse, an astronaut or a racing driver. Several said the latter, inspired by the current heroics of the latest British hero, James Hunt, on the racetrack. When it was my turn, I confidently stated, "I'm going to work in the head office of a major national supermarket chain, marry a girl called Sarah, and we're going to have a daughter called Stacey." This rather odd little speech induced a look from my teacher that was reminiscent of Miss Morris in the playground a few weeks earlier. Before Miss Lang could respond, Gary Roper, a hefty kid from one of the roughest states who was already establishing himself as the class bully, chipped in with, "Thomas wants to marry the fat girl." This brought peals of laughter from the rest of the class, all apart from the girl he was referring to, who burst into tears. I had forgotten that we had a girl named Sarah in our class when I made my bold declaration about my future marriage prospects. When Gary had referred to her as the fat girl, he hadn't been exaggerating because she was very overweight. This was during an era before Britain's childhood obesity crisis kicked in. Back in the 1970s, fat kids were rare, which made them stand out from the crowd. It made them easy targets in a time when mocking other kids for being different was rife. It didn't stop with picking on the fat kids. Four eyes was a common term of derision for those with glasses. Casual racism was also rife, directed at the only two non-white pupils in the school. These included a quiet, withdrawn Chinese girl who was teased with various references to dishes at the local takeaway, and a West Indian boy who had acquired the nickname Chalky after a black character in a popular ITV sitcom. Those with any sort of physical disability were referred to as spastics or spanners. One girl, who had painful, flaky eczema, was referred to as a leper. It was cruel, and I felt that treating people this way was wrong, but the pack mentality of the school thought differently. It was abundantly clear I was the only one who had a problem with it. I later realised this was because I had experienced life in more enlightened times. I saw no point in attracting unwanted attention, so I said nothing. Maybe my quiet complicity made me just as guilty as the others. I don't know. But I had learned to keep my mouth shut in such situations. My earlier comments had already led to me being sent to a lady who was described by my parents and teachers as a special doctor. I later learned that she was a child psychologist. She asked me all sorts of questions, including how I had known Terry was going to fall from the climbing frame. I was wary about exactly where this was leading and just fudged an answer. I said I could see what he had been doing was dangerous and it was just a coincidence that I had predicted his fall. I deliberately gave dumb or false answers to the rest of her questions. Then, after about an hour, she brought the session to a close. I was asked to leave the room while my parents, looking concerned, went in. When they emerged, there was palpable relief on both of their faces. I knew then that I had done the right thing and was off the hook. I just needed to be careful from that point onwards not to blurt out any more incriminating predictions about the future. As the next few years went by, I began to understand more about my condition. Before long, I was convinced that I was unique. I confirmed this hypothesis by having guarded conversations with my friends where I chose my words carefully. I would ask questions that would inspire predictions that would determine what, if anything, they knew about future events. For example, I once asked what year they thought humans would first visit Mars. It was the late 1970s at the time, and the moon landings were still relatively recent. The predictions varied, but most claimed it would be by the year 2000. This was a milestone frequently referred to by people making bold predictions of the amazingly futuristic world we would be living in by then, full of flying cars and robots. I knew that these predictions were impossibly optimistic. I knew that we had never reached Mars in my lifetime, which ran until at least the 2020s. That seemed to be about as far into the future as I could see. Other questions I asked confirmed what I had already concluded. None of them knew anything about the future. Sure, they made the occasional correct prediction, but not with any degree of consistency. I just put these down to random lucky guesses, which anyone could make from time to time. Sometimes, visions of my future would present themselves in my dreams. On other occasions, they would be triggered by specific events or encounters, such as the day we went on a family outing to Birdland in Bourton-on-the-Water. I had never been to this pretty Cotswold village before, but as soon as I saw the place, I recognised it. I also recalled that there was going to be a massive thunderstorm that afternoon. I had worked out by now that I had seen this before, not in this life, but another. The memory only came to me when we arrived. It had taken the visual stimulus of seeing the location to trigger my sense of déjà vu. As predicted, it bucketed down that afternoon, and we ended up hiding from the storm in the tropical birdhouse, listening to the rain hammering down on the clear plastic roof like an endless shower of nuts and bolts. Obviously, I had kept all this to myself. I had no desire to be hauled off to the child psychologist again. There was a children's show on ITV around this time called The Tomorrow People, about a group of kids with special abilities. I likened myself to them and wondered if there might be others like me, but if there were, I had no idea of how to find them. I didn't understand it all yet, but like that day at Birdland, I knew they weren't just visions. I had genuinely experienced these moments before. The question was, how? Had I been reincarnated in some way? Sometimes my insights only came to me shortly before they happened, but other times I had visions of events far in the future. When I had revealed in class that I was going to marry a woman called Sarah, I wasn't talking about my much maligned classmate. I was talking about another Sarah, my soulmate, decades in my future. I knew that I had already shared my life with her, and possibly more than once. They were mostly happy memories at first, until one night when I woke up sweating and terrified after a truly graphic nightmare. I had seen the image of Sarah's lifeless body lying cold and dead on a slab in the morgue. I was there to undertake the grisly task of identifying her corpse after she had been killed in a road traffic accident. The shock of the premonition of her death was incredibly traumatic for me to deal with at just 7 years old. Then, curiously, the following night, I had another dream that directly contradicted the first one. This time, it was about the events of the day leading up to her death. It gave me foreknowledge of exactly how she was going to die. In the dream, I was able to save her by preventing the drunk driver who had mown her down from driving away from the pub. It seemed there were 2 possible futures for Sarah, and I had seen the outcome of each. They couldn't both be true, could they? Either way, I had been given the knowledge I needed to ensure that when the time came, I would know what to do. It was in a future that seemed impossibly far away, but it gave me a sense of purpose. I had my destiny to fulfill. As always, I kept these dreams to myself, even though I woke up so traumatized by the first one that my instinct was to run to my mother for comfort. I didn't, though, and cried myself back to sleep alone. I knew that talking about the future with my parents would only invite trouble. However, there were times when I was able to make use of my premonitions without drawing undue attention to myself, if I was careful. It was a family tradition in our house that everyone was allowed a bet on the Grand National, including myself. I soon discovered that every year on the day of the race, the name of the winner leapt out at me from the paper. When I suggested in 1978 that Lucius might be the trick, my dad put 10p each way on for me at the local bookies, netting me the princely sum of £1.95. When he paid me the money, he lectured me on the dangers of gambling and that this annual flutter should be seen purely as a bit of fun. Dangerous for others, maybe, but not someone who had the sort of edge I did. It was a gift that other gamblers could only dream of. I didn't want to appear unfeasibly lucky, so the following year I deliberately picked a loser. It seemed that I already knew rather a lot about horse racing because I instinctively understood how to read the race cards and what all the different numbers and letters meant. Perhaps it had been a hobby of mine in another life. I could also picture myself at many of the race courses that they showed on TV, even though in this life I had not yet been to one. As I grew older, turning 11 in my final year of primary school, my brain continued to mature, enabling me to make more sense of the never-ending jumble of memories that flooded into my mind every single day. I began to sort them into two different categories, long-term and short-term. The former included an increasing number of visions of my life as a husband and a father. Sarah and I had just the one child, Stacey, and I could picture her at all ages, from infancy to adulthood. Several landmark moments stood out. I recalled many special days from her school nativity to her graduation. Many of the memories were from family holidays, such as building sandcastles and jumping over waves in the sea. These long-term visions mostly came at night. Hardly a night went by that I didn't dream about my future wife and daughter. Unlike other dreams, they didn't fade on waking, the images remaining etched on my mind. I could picture Sarah as clearly as if I were looking at a photograph, her long, blonde hair framing her pale complexion. I could hear her voice, too, finding the distinctive musical lilt of her South Wales accent appealing and reassuring. I did not doubt that she was a real person who existed in my future and that one day we would be together. My short-term memories popped up during my waking hours, usually stimulated by some event or other. These premonitions were often invaluable on a day-to-day basis, enabling me to dodge all manner of potential banana skins. For example, my best friend Martin was heavily into anything to do with astronomy. He had said he wanted to be an astronaut during that circle time session a few years before. Recently, Martin's parents had brought him a telescope for his 11th birthday. When he suggested we set it up outside the front of his house to look at the moon, I agreed. As soon as we got outside on what was a notably frosty November night, scenes of what might occur during the evening poured into my head. I recalled that when we had done this before, Martin had thought it would be a bit of a laugh to spy on the neighbours through their bedroom windows. He was particularly interested in an attractive young lady in the house opposite. He reliably informed me that he was able to ogle at her through a gap in her curtains some evenings as she got out of the shower. He could make out her general body shape from his bedroom window, but that wasn't enough to satisfy his curiosity. He wanted to use the telescope to see what her lady bits looked like close up. As soon as he made his dubious suggestion, the recollection of being apprehended by the police and frog-marched home in disgrace flooded through me. I could almost feel the red, raw sting on my buttocks where my father had given me a good hiding afterwards. One of Martin's neighbours must have seen us and reported us, so I suggested that we set the telescope up in his back garden instead, away from the streetlights where we could get a better view of the moon, thus acquiring the unwelcome future nickname Peeping Tom was avoided. I didn't understand Martin's obsession with the female body at that time. My interest in such things didn't develop until I reached my teens and hit puberty, but Martin used to talk incessantly about women and sex all the time, even though his knowledge was somewhat inaccurate. It was based largely on playground hearsay. On another occasion, the summer following the telescope incident, we stumbled across an old fine fare carrier bag filled with dirty magazines under a bush in the park. Looking inside, I felt quite sickened by some of the pictures of men with large moustaches and sunglasses doing rude things to various naked ladies. It was the first time I had seen such things in this lifetime. However, I instinctively knew that not only had I seen things like this in my previous life, but I had also done the things in the pictures, without the moustache and sunglasses, thankfully. Martin flicked to the centre of one of the magazines, where there were two women doing things to each other with strange rubber objects. There was some accompanying text, but it was in a foreign language which, at a guess, was probably Dutch or German. I really didn't want to see any more, and urged Martin to throw the bag back in the bush, as it wasn't the sort of thing that kids our age ought to be looking at. He laughed and said I must be gay if I didn't like looking at naked women. He promptly stuffed his newly acquired porn stash in his school bag and took it home. A couple of years later, my teenage hormones kicked in, and almost overnight, girls went from being irritating to irresistible. As my interest in them grew, more images of intimate encounters in lives I had lived before began to flood my mind, and not just with Sarah. I continued to use my short-term insights to my advantage by ensuring I chose the right fork in the road at every opportunity. One afternoon, I got a strong sense that I should avoid going down to the park after school to play football. I sensed that if I did, Gary Roper, now with the fearsome reputation of being the hardest kid in school, would end up beating the crap out of me. I couldn't remember the exact details of why he had done it, only a vague memory of a dispute over whether a goal had only hit the post, which wasn't a post at all, just a large pile of coats. I heeded the warning and stayed home, and heard the next day that another kid had been beaten up instead. What the long-term implications of using this information to my advantage might be, I hadn't thought about before. Now, after causing someone else to get hurt, I began to have concerns that my actions might be altering the future. That might not be a good thing, even if it was of benefit to me. I sought answers in the library, where I eagerly devoured every science fiction novel I could find, particularly those with themes of time travel or parallel universes. Books such as The Time Machine by H.G. Wells gave me great insights into the implications of tinkering with the timeline. There was plenty on TV to get me thinking as well. In the early 1980s, I was watching Peter Davison in Doctor Who on weekday evenings and became a huge Star Trek fan as well. Several episodes which dealt with the subject of time travel related to my situation. There was one overriding message that was consistent across all these books and TV shows, which was that changing history was bad. But to me, this wasn't history. I was rewriting events in future, not the past. I might be able to see two possible outcomes, but no one else could. So what did any of it matter? By the time I reached my 16th birthday in 1986, I had pretty much got it all figured out. I was seeing two different timelines. The first I had dubbed the original timeline, which I had concluded was from my first life. That was the world in which Sarah had died. Then there was a second timeline where I had been able to change things with the benefit of hindsight. That's the world in which I had prevented her from being killed. This second life had come with some unusual properties. I had this overwhelming sense that I had lived it backwards in some way, travelling through my own life, getting younger as I went. By that, I don't mean like in the science fiction story The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which I had recently read. In that story, the main protagonist had a strange medical condition where he was born old and got younger as the years passed, but there was no time travel element involved. In my second life, I had been getting younger, moving backwards through the years, one day at a time. That was what had enabled me to save Sarah, amongst other things. I refer to that life as my backwards timeline. Now I was on my third life, moving forwards again, armed with the various bits of information I could pull together from my two previous incarnations. I needed to decide now what use I ought to be making of this knowledge. What might the consequences be if I didn't use it carefully? I had already used it to my advantage, such as escaping Gary Roper's clutches and avoiding the incident with Martin and his telescope. These small changes didn't seem to have altered anything important, but what if I carried on doing it? During my backwards life, I could see that there had been no consequences for anything I did. Each day I had jumped back in time to a point before whatever I had done had happened. I'm ashamed to admit, from some of the sordid memories that came to mind, that I had abused that freedom in ways I wasn't particularly proud of. I had sought out cheap thrills with ladies of dubious virtue, and acquired ill-gotten gains from gambling on races when I knew the results in advance. Most of this had happened in the years after Sarah had been killed. I was lonely and had no opportunity to establish any sort of relationship with a woman due to the weird backwards nature of my existence. Thinking about some of these unsavoury antics now made me feel dirty, but I could erase that possible future simply by ensuring that when the time came, Sarah didn't die. I would not become the shallow, broken person I had been after her death, gambling, whoring, drinking and smoking myself into an early grave. Everything revolved around Sarah and Stacey. I had to ensure I kept them safe, and I knew they were both at risk. Not only did I have to prevent Sarah's death, but I also had to protect Stacey. I had begun having disturbing dreams about her suffering a terrible rape ordeal during her teens. I didn't know the precise details of when and where it would occur, but experience had taught me that the nearer an event got, the more I tended to remember about it, so perhaps the details would be filled in when the time came. The more I thought about Sarah and Stacey, the more I longed to be with them, but they were desperately far away in my future. It was only 1986, and I wouldn't even meet Sarah for another 12 years. Then, one day I was hit with a sobering thought. What if our first meeting never took place? What if the changes I had already made were spreading outwards like ripples on a pond? What if they led to a world where Sarah and I would not end up together? It was hard to see how relatively minor things like those I had done so far could impact things Sarah was doing hundreds of miles away in South Wales, but I had no experience of exactly how this all worked. The recently released Back to the Future movie, which I went to see 3 times, had done nothing to assuage these fears. I concluded that it was vital I didn't do anything from this point onwards that might jeopardize the chances of Sarah and I being together in the future. At one point, I wondered whether I ought to risk waiting 12 years at all. She was alive down in Swansea. Why not just go down and find her right now? Then I wouldn't have to worry about the timeline. Every part of me ached to be with her, but after giving it a lot of thought, I knew that I could not act on these desires. It wasn't the right time. We were not yet the people we would be in 12 years. Trying to make it work now could go wrong for all manner of reasons. We might not be mature enough for a serious relationship. We lived too far apart, and we had college and careers to pursue before we'd be ready for each other. Plus, there would be other girlfriends and boyfriends we needed to be with first. All these experiences, good or bad, would shape us into the people we would become. We simply weren't the finished articles yet. Even if it did work, what if that led to us having another child earlier than we did before? That baby might not be Stacy. It might not even be a girl. How would I feel about that? Would I be able to love another child quite the same way, knowing he or she wasn't quite the same person she should have been? There was only one possible course of action. I had to be patient and live out those 12 years as closely as possible to my original timeline. That meant resisting the temptation to tamper with events, even if my inaction led me into situations I'd rather avoid. I would live my life to the letter exactly as I had the first time. I would keep my head down, keep out of trouble, and keep my fingers crossed that Sarah would be waiting for me in Ibiza in 1998. Once we were together and Stacy was born, maybe I could relax that policy, but until then, I must do my utmost to change nothing. It seemed like a valid plan, and indeed it would have been, except it had one critical flaw that I hadn't taken into consideration. I had confidently assumed that I was the only person in the world with exclusive knowledge of the future. As I was shortly to discover, I was not.
Chapter 2. Ben. I blame Charlotte for everything. I had my life all planned out before she came along and ruined it. Now she's turned my kids against me and forced me out of the marital home, yet everyone's taking her side in the divorce. She's twisted things to the extent that even people I thought were my closest friends now think I'm a twat. That's not me being paranoid. It isn't just a case of being unfriended on Facebook. Some have even had the gall to say it to my face. It is said there are two sides to every story. No one in my daily life will give me the time of day to listen to mine, so I've gone down the pub to see if I can garner some support there. Right now, I'm sitting on a bar stool in the Red Lion, telling my sorry tale to anyone who will listen. It's the first time I've set foot in this dump for years, and I can see why. It's full of losers. I prefer to frequent more upmarket watering holes, but desperate times call for desperate measures. If I can find just one person amongst this ragtag bunch of lost souls who doesn't think I'm a twat, then I'll feel vindicated. I'm not the sort of person who normally seeks self-validation in this way, but I've got to get it all off my chest. Even if they end up thinking I'm just another loser like them, I don't care. I know that I'm way better than them. I've been telling the regulars around the bar all about how I met my wife in 1988 when I was just 18. It's 2020 now, so that's well over 3 decades ago, getting on for half a lifetime. It's wasted time that I will never get back, because most of that time I was utterly bored. Most men would have jumped ship long ago, but I stuck with her out of loyalty and a duty to our children. Nobody seems to give me any credit for that, not going by the reaction of our family and friends. As for my 2 daughters, they aren't even speaking to me anymore. I don't think I was a bad husband. I put food on the table and paid for us to go on holiday every year. We couldn't afford much, a wet week in Tembe if we were lucky, but that wasn't my fault. If I'd gone to university as planned, I'd have had a glittering career and we'd have been jetting off to the Caribbean every year. But I've got her to thank for putting a stop to that. What went wrong? The silly cow only went and got herself pregnant. That's what. I told her to get rid of it. We were still teenagers, for crying out loud, but no, she had this big anti-abortion thing going on and refused. She was always banging on about some issue or other. I should have realized the first day I met her when she was wearing a Smith's Meat is Murder t-shirt that she was going to be that type. You know the ones, jumping on whatever trendy bandwagon is flavour of the month. After she found out she was pregnant, she tried to blame me for refusing to wear condoms, Not that she had been that bothered about it in the heat of the moment. I had only worn one once before, when I lost my virginity to a posh, horsey girl called Rosie West. It was the summer of '87, and we were drunk on cheap cider at a young farmer's party just outside Chesterton. She was a year or two older than me, and when she invited me up to the hayloft, it didn't take much persuasion for me to succumb to her advances. Safe sex was a big deal at the time, with the massive AIDS scare striking fear into the populace. Everywhere you looked, from billboards to TV, the "don't die of ignorance" message was being rammed down your throat. Rosie insisted on me rubbering up, and fortunately she had brought her own because I didn't have any. Afterwards I felt a bit sore down there, and concluded that I must be allergic to latex. I decided I had better not risk wearing one again, and besides, I hated the whole idea of using them anyway. It just didn't seem natural to me. In my opinion, the whole AIDS thing was being way overblown, but it seemed I was in a minority with that view. When the topic came up in conversation one day in the refectory at college, I said I didn't see what the big deal was. Most of my friends were horrified, saying that I was being totally irresponsible. When I retorted by saying that I considered contraception to be a woman's responsibility, I got called a male chauvinist pig, by a woman, of course. After that, I avoided mentioning the subject again. You know how touchy they can be. When I met Charlotte and spun her my allergy story, she believed me. I'm sure she said she was on the pill anyway, so it didn't matter. Of course, after she found out she was pregnant, she denied she had ever said anything of the sort, pushing the blame onto me. We were both drunk at the time, which lowered inhibitions, so it's all a bit of a blur as to what exactly was said. I tried to blame it on the drink when it all blew up, but got short shrift from the moralistic do-gooders. Apparently, blaming alcohol wasn't an acceptable excuse, even if 20th century culture was steeped in booze. It all happened one drunken lunchtime in early 1988. I was in the second year of a BTEC in business studies at a sixth form college in Oxford. It was going well enough for me to have a real prospect of getting into a decent university. I was working hard, but enjoyed plenty of leisure time too. Every lunchtime I could be found at the pub opposite the college, which was the hub of the student social life. The Duke was a real old-fashioned spit and sawdust boozer, with cheap beer and an ageing landlord nearing retirement. Old Arthur, who reminded me of the racing pundit John McCririck, with his large whiskers and flamboyant clothing, was more than happy to risk serving underage students to boost his pension. He was certainly doing a roaring trade because the pub was packed every lunchtime. For many it was an infinitely more attractive option than the library, even if it wasn't doing their livers or their grades any good. I was young enough to be still enjoying the novelty factor of drinking in pubs, and was often eagerly waiting for the front door to open at 11 a.m. My course only involved about 12 hours of lectures a week, and most of these were conveniently scheduled outside lunchtime drinking hours. It was fortunate that pubs hadn't yet started opening all day, because I doubt that some of us would ever have gone back after lunch. As it was, I frequently attended afternoon classes somewhat the worse for drink. Not that the lecturers ever noticed. Many of them were similarly inebriated after boozy sessions in the Albion, a smoky den of iniquity up the road. It seems like a different world now, but that was the Britain of the 1980s, when boozy lunches were part of the culture, and smoking was allowed pretty much everywhere. Despite this, the economy wasn't suffering. By 1988, Britain was booming, with a new breed of affluent, successful youngsters emerging. The media referred to these people as yuppies. These upwardly mobile types weren't to be found sipping halves of Harp lager and smoking silk cut in the back room of the Duke. They were portrayed by the media as champagne-swilling stockbroker types,
consulting their filofaxes, listening to Dire Straits, and getting rich in the City of London. It was a lifestyle I aspired to, and the main driver behind my choice of business studies. I saw this as my first step towards joining the yuppies. It was all very well hanging around with the plebs in the Duke for the moment, but I knew I was destined for bigger and better things. I hadn't had the advantage of attending one of the city's top private schools, but I knew plenty who had through my local rugby club. But that didn't matter. In the future, when people asked where I was educated, I could just say Oxford. I didn't need to specify exactly where. The name of the city was prestigious enough. The A-level students at the college were bearable, but the day-release students, some of whom worked in factories, were very boorish. Thankfully, they were only around 1 day a week before they went back to whatever mundane, manual job their lowly aspirations had led them to choose. I made sure I worked hard on my coursework in the evenings to make up for any lost time in the pub during the day. I was well ahead of most of my peers, and I made sure they knew it, showing them up with my clever comments in my lectures. Unfortunately, I had become lumbered with Charlotte. I rue to this day the events that led up to me ending up with her.